Quick disclaimer. Information in this podcast is for general informational purposes only and is not intended to be treated as medical advice. Always consult with your healthcare team before making changes to your diet, lifestyle, supplementation, or medication.
I think we can do better because what we really need from the medical care guidelines for diabetes, especially in terms of diet and nutrition, are clear recommendations. And there is certainly an abundance of research to support the provision of clearer recommendations than we currently have.
Welcome to Type 2 Diabetes Talk, the place where we chat about what really works to treat type 2 diabetes and prediabetes naturally with nutrition and lifestyle. If you're looking to optimize blood sugar and A1C, lose weight, reduce medications, and improve your overall health, this is the place to be. Now, here's your host, Type 2 Diabetes Nutrition Specialist, Dr. Jeddah.
Hello, wonderful people. Dr. Jeddah here, and welcome to episode 9, where we'll be doing an investigation on the diabetes guidelines. The American Diabetes Association, also known as ADA, has been a leader in terms of diabetes guidelines as they are the only ones worldwide that have been publishing annual diabetes guidelines since 1989. Other places around the world update their guidelines every 2 to 5 years, and usually they follow along with what the ADA guidelines recommend. Back in 1989, the guidelines were only 4 pages long, with 10 references. In 2005, there were 33 pages with 177 references. Fast forward to 2024, and the medical care guidelines are now 328 pages long with thousands and thousands of references. I always await the new guidelines each year, which get released in around mid-December. And these days I bounce around the chapters in the medical care guidelines, usually all year, because there is just so much to cover. Overall, we don't tend to see a great deal of changes in the guidelines from year to year, although slowly we hope to see new evidence included in the guidelines. Mostly, I'm interested in Chapter 5, which is about diet and lifestyle. So that's always the first chapter I dive into. As you can imagine, back in 1989, there wasn't much covered on diet and lifestyle at all, only a few sentences within the section about having an individualised management plan. Today, there are several pages, but all in all, the guidelines really aren't that helpful. The medical care guidelines are designed for health professionals to give them guidance so they can help their patients with diabetes improve their health. But the dietary guidelines are quite vague. And unless you're prepared to go and do substantial research yourself, overall I'd think most health professionals wouldn't find them very useful at all. And after we chat about some of the specific guidelines, you'll see what I mean. Firstly, I wanted to mention digital health programs. In 2020 to 21, there were still reservations regarding the effectiveness of digitally delivered diabetes education. Of course, people like myself knew they were effective because we'd been online for a decade at DMP, but in scientific terms, evidence was still emerging, which was another reason I did my PhD as well, so I could contribute to the evidence to show how valuable digital health programs can be. So it's great to see the 2024 guidelines following on from 2023 to continue to suggest that there is strong evidence to support the use of digital interventions and support. And I'm pleased to say my systematic review is among the evidence again in Chapter 1 and Chapter 5, as it has been for the past few years. We know that digital programs, good ones that are proven to be effective, such as my T2 diet program, are more effective than in-person care. Access to effective digital programs is so important because we know that at least half of people with diabetes never get any education and support. This is due to lots of different things. There's a lack of support out there in general, lack of professionals to provide proper education. Knowledge of programs and referral to programs doesn't happen, and limited access and availability to programs overall. So one of the best advantages of digital programs is you can access them anywhere, anytime, and that makes them incredibly convenient for you. But more importantly, you need to make sure you take a program that's proven to be effective. So always keep that in mind. Now, I want to chat about some of the specific dietary guideline sections in Chapter 5 of the Medical Care Guidelines, which is the section on diet and lifestyle. One of the important things we have learned in nutrition science over the years is that it's your overall eating plan that makes the biggest difference to your health, not any one food you might eat. And we know there are foods that are destructive to our health and foods that are beneficial. In a general sense, we know that consuming sugar-sweetened drinks, eating sugar-laden junk foods, too many sweets, and processed foods loaded with refined grains are detrimental to our health. And in the general sense, we know healthy, nutrient-dense foods are vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, nuts, seeds, meats, and dairy products. I say in a general sense because this is what we know to be true across all dietary guidelines. And the dietary guidelines for diabetes are generally based on the dietary guidelines for the whole population. We know that if you have a healthy eating pattern, you're going to be healthier. In contrast, if you have an unhealthy eating pattern, you're more likely to develop health issues. Of course, this makes sense logically, and we have an abundance of research to show this is true. And as I said, it is your overall eating plan that makes the biggest difference to your health. So you always want to choose healthier food sources. That goes without saying. Consistently, throughout the guidelines over the years, it has stated that there is not a one-size-fits-all eating plan for diabetes. This does make sense because that is going to depend on your taste and personal preferences. Your version of any type of eating plan will be different to someone else's depending on the exact foods you choose to include. The overriding message here is simply choose nutrient-dense, healthy foods and minimise sugar and processed foods. As an overriding message, any doctor, dietitian, nutritionist, health professional or other could agree with that. One thing that is incredibly confusing in the guidelines every single year, and I wish it would be updated, is further clarification on the macronutrients. We have 3 macronutrients: carbohydrate, protein, and fat. The guidelines always say, evidence suggests that there is not an ideal percentage of calories from carbohydrate, protein, and fat for people with diabetes. I understand the guidelines can be flexible, and with each person, there may be specific alterations we can make. But can we at least provide some better guidance so that people, health professionals, can have a better path to follow, because we do in fact have the evidence. Let's chat about carbohydrates in particular, and let's just backtrack a bit. Since 2016, the guidelines have stated studies examining the ideal amount of carbohydrate intake for people with diabetes are inconclusive, although monitoring carbohydrate intake and considering the blood glucose response to dietary carbohydrate are key for improving postprandial glucose control. In the 2024 guidelines, a very similar statement rings true. Studies examining the optimal amount of carbohydrate intake for people with diabetes are inconclusive, although monitoring carbohydrate intake is a key strategy in reaching glucose goals in people with type 1 and type 2 diabetes. Okay, we know carbohydrate is the most important nutrient for people with diabetes. It has the single biggest impact on blood sugar because all carbohydrate foods, all of them, break down into sugar or glucose and enter the bloodstream. This is no secret and it has been known for a very long time. Back in the 2005 guidelines, it states, both the amount, grams of carbohydrate, as well as the type of carbohydrate in a food influence blood glucose level. The total amount of carbohydrate consumed is a strong predictor of glycemic response, and thus, monitoring total grams of carbohydrate, whether by use of exchanges or carbohydrate counting, remains a key strategy in achieving glycemic control. Back to the 2024 guidelines, it states monitoring carbohydrate intake is a key strategy in reaching blood glucose goals. Of course, we know that. It's well established. Then, in the next paragraph, it states, for people with type 2 diabetes, low carbohydrate and very low carbohydrate eating patterns in particular have been found to reduce A1C and the need for anti-hypoglycemic medications. Boom! There's your carbohydrate guideline right there. Low carbohydrate and very low carbohydrate are the best eating plans for reducing people's A1C and medications. And yet, the guidelines go on and on with fluff about there being no optimal amount of carbohydrates. But they've contradicted themselves by saying that low carbohydrate and very low carbohydrate eating patterns in particular have been found to reduce A1C and the need for anti-hypoglycemic medications. So provide some proper guidelines around this, please, ADA. But no, just blanket statements that proclaim there is no optimal amount of carbohydrate. It just makes no sense. For the past 4 years, the ADA guidelines from 2020 through to 2023 have specifically acknowledged reducing overall carbohydrate intake for individuals with diabetes has demonstrated the most evidence for improving glycemia and may be applied to a variety of eating patterns. There it is again. Reducing overall carbohydrate has demonstrated the most evidence for improving blood sugar and A1C. Even though nothing has changed, and in fact, we probably now have more evidence, they've now removed that specific statement from the 2024 guidelines. It now says, consider reducing overall carbohydrate intake for adults with diabetes to improve glycemia, as this approach may be applied to a variety of eating patterns that meet individual needs and preferences. I'm sorry, but that just seems a bit weak and doesn't inspire a recommendation that could be highly beneficial to people. If reducing overall carbohydrate has demonstrated the most evidence for improving blood sugar and A1C levels and reducing medications, why is this not emphasised again and again in the medical care guidelines? Being this is my area of expertise in practice and research, we know that there is a specific carbohydrate range that should be recommended, and it's disappointing that it's not included in the guidelines. The carbohydrate recommendation they should be including in the guidelines is that health professionals should recommend their patients consume under 26% carbohydrate from daily energy intake. Full stop. That's what all the research shows conclusively. We don't want this inconclusive nonsense because it's not helpful to anyone, and I can tell you that if the guidelines did specifically suggest that people consume under 26% carbohydrate from daily energy intake, we'd see masses and masses of people changing their diabetes health. I just don't understand that given the evidence we have, that more specific guidelines can't be made. We just keep pushing the general dietary guidelines, the low-fat, high-carb diets, or suggesting things like people choose low glycemic index foods. Encouraging high carbohydrate intake doesn't help A1C and certainly doesn't reduce people's medication, so why are we still encouraging that? Focusing on glycemic index only is also nonsense. Systematic reviews of glycemic index show minimal reductions in A1C and no impact on reducing medications. So why are we still pushing that? Why can't we just get down to the core of the issue and say quite simply that people need to be under 26% carbohydrate from daily energy intake? In a 2,000 calorie per day eating plan, that's less than 130 grams of carbs per day. The recommendation I encourage is a bit lower, to aim for between 50 to 100 grams of carbs per day. But if anything, definitely keep your carbs to less than 130 grams per day. I know from conducting my own research that most people are eating much more than this. The average in my randomised controlled trial on entry was around 225 grams. That's moderate carb intake. And by slashing another 100 grams off, people saw their A1C levels come down, effortless weight loss, and a reduction in medication. Some dramatically reduced and even stopped medication in as little as 16 weeks. So the thing is, we know conclusively that carbohydrate has the single biggest impact on blood sugar, and there are proven carbohydrate guidelines demonstrating the best outcomes in multiple trials and reviews. So let's stop being vague and provide proper guidelines. If you need more guidance on the types of foods to avoid or minimise, grab a free copy of our food list at type2diabetestalk.com/food list. And members, you can find the food list and our huge range of detailed food guides inside the members' site.
Get proven, practical support to lower blood sugar, weight, and medication. Check out Dr. Jetta's programs and services at type2diabetestalk.com/programs.
Another thing I noticed in the 2024 guidelines was a new emphasis on low-fat dairy and minimising meat. In 2023, it stated, eating plans should emphasise non-starchy vegetables, fruits, legumes, whole grains, as well as dairy products, with minimal added sugars. In 2024, it states, food-based dietary patterns should emphasise key nutrition principles, inclusion of non-starchy vegetables, whole fruits, legumes, whole grains, nuts and seeds, and low-fat dairy products, and minimising consumption of meat, sugar-sweetened beverages, sweets, refined grains, and ultra-processed foods. My thoughts when reading this were, where is the evidence on the benefits of low-fat dairy to full-fat dairy? And where is the evidence for minimising consumption of meat? I'm thinking, here we go again. Why have they suddenly switched back to low-fat dairy when the evidence just doesn't support that? And the meat. Previously, guidelines have at least included lean meats, poultry, and seafood, but now we should minimise meat? Meat is a nutrient-dense food source, so where is the evidence? So, of course, I dug in, and in the protein section, there's an addition in the 2024 guidelines that states, strong evidence suggests higher plant protein intake and replacement of animal protein with plant protein is associated with lower risk of all-cause and cardiovascular mortality. There's one reference to the Women's Health Initiative population study. This is not really strong evidence. Firstly, it is only limited to one gender of the population, women, and we know diabetes is not limited to women only. Secondly, the data were limited to postmenopausal women aged 50 to 79 years only, so that excludes even more of the diabetes population. So again, it's not really strong evidence to suggest a guideline when it excludes major sections of the diabetes population. In addition, the paper actually showed a 5% replacement of plant protein with animal protein to be associated. So it's a bit misleading because the statement by the ADA kind of suggests people are removing animal protein altogether for plant protein, and that's not actually the case. The second statement in this section says, a meta-analysis of 13 RCTs showed replacing animal with plant proteins leads to small improvements in A1C and fasting glucose in individuals with type 2 diabetes. I looked at this paper, and the majority of the trials, except 2, consisted of a partial replacement of animal with plant protein. So again, people did not exclude animal protein altogether. So again, the ADA's statement should have been clearer in the guidelines provided here. The review actually said that the average animal protein replaced was around 35% substituted with plant protein. All diets compared were high carb, 40 to 70%, and the A1C reduction was very small, just 0.15%. In addition, 85% of the trials assessed in the review were poor quality. So all in all, that's not very compelling evidence, and I certainly wouldn't say it's strong evidence at all. Don't get me wrong, I'm all for plant protein, but I just want to say, why are we demonising meat? Especially when we know it's the overall healthy eating pattern that's important, and inclusion of nutrient-dense foods is recommended. Meat is a nutrient-dense food. And also, why are we demonising meat when whole grains are more detrimental to blood sugar and diabetes health, and yet we're actively promoting people with diabetes eat these, often in amounts that are very harmful? There was no additional evidence provided to state why the guidelines now suddenly say low-fat dairy instead of just dairy. I just wish that when they were making guidelines and recommendations and they were saying they had strong evidence, that they actually have strong evidence, and that whatever the guidelines are based on, they're providing good references, and the guidelines are based on facts and not just opinion or whatever else they seem to be based on. Coming back to protein though, for protein, the recommendations provided in the ADA guidelines are also inconclusive. Although high protein diets of 20 to 30% protein have been shown to improve appetite satisfaction and control. My recommendation is to include a wide variety of nutrient-dense protein sources such as meat, poultry, seafood, eggs, nuts, seeds, dairy, tofu, tempeh, and small amounts of beans and legumes. For fat, the recommendations provided in the ADA guidelines are also inconclusive. Although it shouldn't be, fat is still a highly controversial topic, and saturated fats are still being demonised, although they shouldn't be when they are coming from nutrient-dense whole foods. For example, olive oil contains 9 to 20% saturated fat, but it is a very healthy fat with many known health benefits. I'm going to leave the whole topic of fat until another time because it is a big one. So generally, we do encourage more monounsaturated and omega-3 fats, so include things like olive oil, avocado, olives, nuts and seeds, and fish like salmon and tuna. In terms of sodium, the recommendation is always the same, less than 2,300 milligrams a day. So here's the thing, if you don't eat too many processed foods, you generally don't have to worry about sodium intake at all, because guess where we get most of the salt or sodium in our diet? Processed and packaged foods, and it all adds up. The past few years, there have been some controversial things that have come out around sweeteners. There has been research for some time showing negative effects of artificial sweeteners like aspartame, which we find in many diet products these days. In mid-2023, the World Health Organization put out a new guideline to advise against the use of non-nutritive sweeteners. In their statement, they included many types of sweeteners, including artificial ones like ACE-K, aspartame, advantame, cyclamates, neotame, saccharin, sucralose, and more naturally based sweeteners like stevia and stevia derivatives. The statement, though, wasn't really about damaging effects of these sweeteners, but rather the fact that replacing free sugars with non-nutritive sweeteners does not help with weight control in the long term. This is likely true because if a person is eating lots of packaged and processed foods or even lots of sweets with sweeteners rather than sugar, then their diet is probably not going to be much better in terms of quality. Another controversial thing from mid-2023 was that, based on limited evidence, the International Agency for Research on Cancer classified aspartame as a potential carcinogen to humans. There were also huge headlines across the globe in February 2023 about the sweetener erythritol, based on a Cleveland Clinic study press release proclaiming that erythritol will lead to stroke, heart attack, or cardiac events. Unfortunately, these were just headlines, and both the researchers and the journalists grossly misreported the facts. But as a result, people believed it, as they often do. Upon closer inspection of the research paper, there were major flaws in the study methods, and the outcomes were misreported. I reported on this at the time on the DMP blog, so I'll link to that in the show notes if you'd like to see more information on that. In terms of sweeteners, based on the research I've done, the best types of sweeteners are stevia and monk fruit, and the tolls like erythritol and xylitol. And as for erythritol, there seems to be no reported side effects or studies to prove any adverse effects, unlike artificial sweeteners like aspartame, which we definitely recommend you try to avoid. Members, you can find detailed information and guides on all of the sweeteners inside the Members Library. I've got several other chapters of the ADA's 2024 Medical Care Guidelines to work through, so I could go on and on, but I'm going to leave it there for now. The Medical Care Guidelines for diabetes are good. I enjoy reading them each year and hope to always see things evolving, even if it's slowly. But as someone who has been working and researching in the field of diabetes nutrition for over a decade, I also have to say the guidelines are not great. The medical care guidelines are designed for health professionals to give them guidance so they can help their patients with diabetes improve their health. But the dietary guidelines are just so vague and not really helpful at all. If we really want to support people with diabetes to improve their health, we certainly need clearer dietary guidelines that health professionals can recommend with certainty. Hopefully, we will see that happen in future, but in the meantime, we will continue to provide quality, evidence-based information, education and support here on Type 2 Diabetes Talk, and over at DMP, where we provide programs and services with proven practical solutions that can help you achieve and maintain your blood sugar and health goals. In the next episode, I'll be joined by Emily, DMP dietitian, where we'll be answering some questions submitted by our listeners and members. If you're enjoying Type 2 Diabetes Talk so far, please help spread the word by sharing it with others and by leaving a positive review on your favourite podcast platform. Together, we can make a big difference. Thanks again for joining me today for episode 9, and see you next week for our Q&A session. Dr. Jeddah, over and out.
Thanks for tuning in to Type 2 Diabetes Talk. Please subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform. And for episode replays, episode notes, and more, visit type2diabetestalk.com. New episodes are available Tuesdays, 10 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time, or your time zone equivalent. Thanks again. We're truly grateful to be a part of your life and help make a real difference.